Hey everybody, it's Mr. Hefner again. Today's lesson is coming to you from New Hampshire. I'm in Jackson, New Hampshire, where they're actually famous, just like Berks County, just like Pennsylvania, for their covered bridges. And this is one of their great classic New England covered bridges here in Jackson, New Hampshire. I'm here because we're going to read a story that takes place in New Hampshire. It's a fairly long story, so I'm going to make it a short introduction, but it is a great story. It's one of my all-time favorites. And it's by Vincent Benet. He was a Pennsylvania author. If you've ever been up in the Lehigh Valley, you might know there's a town up there called Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and that's where Vincent Benet was from. So let's get started with today's introduction. All right, kind of a spooky start here. The story's not as spooky as the screen would lead you to believe. The story's called The Devil and Daniel Webster, and The Simpsons did it, but we'll get to that later. This is a story by Vincent Benet, who was from Bethlehem in Pennsylvania, and it's a story about a man who makes a deal with the devil. Now, that's kind of an ancient concept going back a long time. The idea, I mean, it's even in the Charlie Daniels song, The Devil Went Down to Georgia. If you make a deal with the devil, you usually get something really nice, but the payment, the catch, is your soul, so the devil gets your soul. This is a story about a man who makes a deal with the devil, and then starts to think twice about it. And so he goes looking for a really great lawyer to get him out of the deal. And that lawyer is Daniel Webster. So I think if you look at the images on this particular slide, you can figure out for yourself which one is the devil. But the other one is Daniel Webster. And Daniel Webster was he was an attorney. He was a United States senator. And we're going to take a look when I get some more stuff up here. But he had a reputation for being able to change people's minds with his words. He was such a fantastic speaker, and he was so smart that he could just make things happen just with his own voice. And so in this case, this real person from American history is going to come and defend our fictional character who made the deal with the devil that he now regrets. It's a great story, and I think you're going to love the story. All right, so the topic, of course, is the story, The Devil and Daniel Webster by Vincent Benet. If you're taking Cornell notes, you'll want to put the topic and the lesson essential question in it. Our lesson essential question today is going to be, what are the qualities of a tall tale? Now, that's not a new one. This is like a repeat. If you remember back to our first literature unit, which was folklore, one of the things we read was a tall tale. We read a song about John Henry. I almost lost that. I was going to say Paul Bunyan, which is another tall tale, but it was a song about John Henry and how he went to work against a machine and worked so hard he beat the machine, but then he died at the end of the song. This is not folklore, but it can still be a tall tale. So tall tales are stories that are going to use a lot of exaggeration to make an effect. And the literary term for exaggeration is hyperbole. And we'll get that with our literary tools a little bit later. So there's your title, The Devil and Daniel Webster by Vincent Benet. And if we were in class and we were going to do a reader's journal, the question would be this: when have you made a choice that commanded a very high price at a later time? Sometimes we make these little deals and decisions, and they seem great right now, but later on we pay the price. Now, we might not have actually made a deal with the devil, but sometimes people decide, you know what, I've got this car, it's 6 years old now, I think I'd like a new car. And they go out and they pick out a really nice car with all the options, and they're like, oh, I'm going to love this car so much. And they buy a car which is a little more expensive than they usually buy, but they really love this car. But then 6 months later, that car doesn't feel so new anymore. You've been driving it for 6 months. And every month you have to make a new car payment, and you look and you realize your car payments are going to go on for another 4.5 years. Why did I make this choice? My old car was fine. So that's kind of what we're talking about. Almost everybody at some point makes a decision that later on we start to question, was this really worth it? Now, our literary tools for today's piece are going to be suspension of disbelief, right? Again, suspension of disbelief doesn't mean you believe, right? If I read a Harry Potter book, I need to use a lot of suspension of disbelief. I can't sit there the whole time with the book saying, but there's no such thing as Hogwarts, but there can't be muggles and magicians or muggles and wizards or warlocks or whatever they call them in this world. This just doesn't make, because you wouldn't enjoy the story. On the other hand, you're not like, this Hogwarts place sounds so cool. I think I'll take my family on vacation there next year, because you know it's not real. What you do is you don't believe, but you suspend your disbelief. In other words, I don't really believe this, but I'm going to put that aside for now. I'm just going to put that aside so I can enjoy this story right now. You need a lot of that whenever you read a tall tale, because the exaggerations are beyond belief, so you need to suspend your disbelief. And then the other word is going to be hyperbole. I know you know character. We've talked about all kinds of characters so far, and we did a tall tale when we did our first folklore unit, but hyperbole is the word I want you to focus on right now. This one right here, hyperbole. It looks like hyperbole. And if you want to call it hyperbole to help you remember the definition, that's okay. Hyper means above. It means beyond. So if you talk about somebody behaving in a kind of hyper way, they're not hyper, they're being hyperactive. We just say hyper, but we mean hyperactive, which means they're overactive. Sometimes people have high blood pressure, right? And we use the word hyper for that. We call it hypertension, which means the pressure, the tension in your blood, but it's too high. So what we want to look for in this story is we want to look for descriptions that are above and beyond. A synonym for hyperbole would just be an exaggeration. But it's an exaggeration for a literary effect, to create a feeling in the reader. Now, this story, I told you a little bit about it. Here's your quick summary. It's about a man who makes a bargain with the devil. Now, this is an American version of the story, and so it throws that American hero Daniel Webster in here. Daniel Webster lived before the American Civil War, and he played a major role in American history. He was a hero for a long time to a lot of people for many reasons. This story was originally published in a magazine because in the days before everybody had television, short stories in America were really popular. And short stories generally don't get published in books. You can go buy books of short stories, but the short stories are generally published individually first. And then once you have a collection of them, you may choose to publish them in a book later on. And in this particular story, we're going to have a real patriotic American coming to do his duty to save another American. Everything about the patriotism, the stars and stripes, the color, it's all over the top. All right, and that's going to be the style of this particular story. Now, the historical connection here, just a little bit about Daniel Webster. You might have talked about him, or you might talk about him later this year in your American history class. So he's born in 1782. So 1782 is around the time of the end of the American Revolution, but before there is the Constitution. America is just a baby of a country. And the Civil War, which divides America up, starts in 1861. So he dies before we get to the Civil War. But his life has a lot to do with the Civil War. So he was a great orator. According to the book, they called him an orator. And this ORA is like in oral. It means a public speaker. So an orator is a public speaker. And in the old days, public speakers were sort of like entertainment. If you had something special going on, you might bring some orator in to give you a 2-hour speech that would get everybody all hyped up and excited about something. This particular guy, as a senator and as a lawyer, he argued a bunch of cases before the Supreme Court of the United States, the highest court in the land. We call our Constitution, the number one law of the whole country. All laws come from the Constitution. Nothing can exist without that. And the Supreme Court hears cases related to that. He argued a bunch of cases there. When he was a senator, he dealt with the issue of slavery a lot. Now, he was from New Hampshire, and New England was an abolitionist area. They were totally against slavery. And yet, at the same time, you ran the risk of, if we want to get rid of slavery right now, then those southern states may just leave the Union and break up the United States. So Daniel Webster was always trying to find ways that we can keep the country together. Just keep the country together. And at some points in his life, people accused him of being soft on slavery, that he wasn't fighting hard enough to stop slavery. But his number one goal was, let's not let this country break apart here. We want to keep this together. And one of the things that he dealt with was this thing called the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise occurred in 1820. So right now, at the time I'm talking to you today it's 2020. So it was exactly 200 years ago from this year. And what was going on with this thing called the Missouri Compromise was, if you just take a look here, we had a bunch of states in the South, and they had slaves. And then we had a bunch of states in the North, and most of them were against slavery altogether. But as the country began to expand, there was this question of, well, when new states come into the United States, should they be allowed slavery or should they not be allowed slavery? And Missouri was coming into the country at that time, and Missouri was a great cotton growing country. And so the people in the South were like, we want Missouri to be able to grow cotton. And the only way in those days they thought they could do cotton was if they had slave labor to pick the cotton. But in the North, they were afraid of letting slavery expand. So in the end, there was this thing called the Missouri Compromise. And what the compromise was this: Missouri was allowed to come into the country as a slave state. But at the same time, the state of Maine, way up here, which had previously been part of Massachusetts, the state of Maine was allowed to be created. Now, on one hand, it allows more slave territory. On the other hand, it created 2 more senators for Missouri and 2 more senators for Maine. So it kept the balance of power with the states in the North equal to the balance of power with the states in the South. But it caused all kinds of problems. And in this story, Daniel Webster is going to refer to the Missouri Compromise, and I just want you to understand what he's talking about there. So there's a very stern picture of him. He was alive when the camera was invented, so his pictures were some of the first ones ever taken. And those old black and white pictures, you notice people always seem so austere, like they never smile. It wasn't that they were mean, and it wasn't that they were trying to look tough. But what really happened in those old cameras, sometimes it would take several seconds, like 15 to 20 seconds, to be able to take a picture, and you couldn't move at all. So people always sat for their pictures. But one of the things they found was smiling takes muscles. And if you smile for too long, your muscles start to twitch and you get a blurry picture. So they used to take people to just let their faces completely relax and just sit there and hold your breath and don't move. And unfortunately, not smiling made people look like they were always miserable in their old pictures. All right, now the author, Stephen Vincent Benet, I told you he's from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So far as this course goes, he's our first Pennsylvania author. And he did a lot of lighthearted kind of fun stuff. So he's born at the end of, the 1800s, that would be the 19th century, and he actually dies right in the middle of World War II, if that helps you put things into perspective. And he did some travel writing. He was very well educated. He got a lot of support for his art and things like that. But probably the things that he's most famous for are, number one, this story, The Devil and Daniel Webster. He's also famous for, he did a book about the Civil War called John Brown's Body. And you might know that John Brown started that raid at Harper's Ferry, one of the first actions, that led to the Civil War. He wrote this in 1928 during the Jazz Age, but what makes it so unusual, it's a story of the Civil War, but he wrote the entire thing as one gigantic poem. So it's a poem that fills a whole book. Now, in ancient Greece or Rome, they would have done that all the time with their epic stories. But it was sort of an experiment in 1928 to do that with a story about America. But you can kind of make the connection. Here's a guy taking an American story, our Civil War, and he's doing it in the epic style of like the ancient legends of Odysseus or something like that. The other thing he wrote, which became more famous later on, he wrote a story called Sobbin' Women. And sobbin' would mean crying women, kind of. They were always crying. And later on, that was turned into a musical called Seven Brides for Seven Brothers. Weiser did that one way back. I think it was around 1999 or 1920, around 1999 or 2000 or something like that. So we have done that here. And he's won a lot of awards. All right, as you read this story, take Cornell notes. It's always good to jot down the plot, major characters, where you see different literary tools happening. You can use them on your test. But as I've said before, the great thing about Cornell notes is if you take Cornell notes, you learn the material the first time, and you often don't need to study your Cornell notes. Outline the plot if you can. Again, look for things like the exposition, the story before the story, the inciting incident, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, the resolution, and sometimes a little bit of a denouement at the end. But here's the biggie today. This is a tall tale, so you shouldn't have any trouble finding examples of hyperbole. Look for those exaggerations throughout the story that make a literary purpose. All right, and then just kind of, because it's kind of fun and creepy at the same time, I added these two pictures at the end here. We'll talk about suspension of disbelief when we get done, but this is that same picture I gave you. This is an old photograph of Daniel Webster right here. That's what he looked like in life. But in the 19th century, it was common when people were famous, after they died, they would bring an artist in who would make a plaster cast of the face. And these were called death masks. So they would make a cast of the face, and then they would make different sort of like actual faces from that and sell them. And this is actually Daniel Webster's death mask right here. So that is what he looked like when he looked on probably the day he died. They didn't wait to do these because they didn't preserve bodies in those days. And so that is probably an exact image of what he looked like on the day that he died. Kind of a creepy old practice. I'm glad we don't do that anymore. Okay, so I'm going to hang out here in New Hampshire for a little bit longer, but if you're working from home, you want to go to the story, you'll find it on Schoology. It's called The Devil and Daniel Webster, and you're going to read it from beginning to end. Look for examples of the hyperbole, look for the examples of the plot development, and look for the humor that's in there too, because it's a really funny story, kind of makes fun of American politics, even all the way back going to the 19th century. All right, I'll see you guys soon.